Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry. We aggregate those perspectives and elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Last week on the program in episode 171, we talked about something that I think is really important, and that's the underappreciated benefits and some of the core advantages that are inherent to cooperative governance, and topics that, frankly, I feel deserve more time and more credit. We so quickly default to all the challenges of cooperative governance and sometimes fail to recognize the very significant base level advantages associated with it. So we talked, about why cooperative governance even exists as a concept, what the benefits are when it's functioning in a healthy and productive manner. We talked specifically about where things break down and where those issues that we all kind of talk about and fret about, where those issues emerge. And then we talked about, from the research, what does good governance look like? And those were largely from, I would say, procedural or more of an administrative standpoint. They were things like director education has to be ongoing, not just in the onboarding period, right? Continuous education and training for the board is a core part of its development, which is a driver of its effectiveness. We talked about boards having explicit norms around where does the board's authority stop and the CEO's government authority start, kind of, not having this constant tension between what is governance versus management, but being explicit about, okay, where are those boundaries and how do we navigate that when there's something that's kind of right on the edge. We talked about the potential for term limits and succession planning, for the board itself, not just for the C-suite, and what that does in terms of helping you prepare and recruit the next generation of directors, kind of planning for succession on the board before the seat is actually empty. And then we talked about, it kind of touched on briefly the board's role in actually approving and owning the strategy of the co-op, and not just ratifying the plan that management brings in. Now, that one in particular is a little bit contentious. I know that we have some folks that believe very strongly in one direction, folks that have very strong arguments in the opposite direction. And it's something that I'd like to continue to explore on the program and get lots of perspectives on the topic. And so that's something you can expect that we'll be revisiting in the weeks and months ahead. But in last week's episode, I also referenced that I myself had developed a short list of observed behaviors that I've encountered with cooperative boards that I think indicate what makes for a very high-performing and effective team. And that's where I want to spend a little bit of time today. Now, to be frank and candid and vulnerable for a moment here, I want to acknowledge that this episode is different from last week. I'm not going to rely on research citations, right? These observations haven't been run through an academic, peer-reviewed, stress-tested framework, right? They're my own observations from being a practitioner in this industry. So they're based on my own pattern recognition from the time spent inside cooperative boardrooms and with board directors working through the work that they're required to do as part of that job. Now, I see these all as building upon the table stakes that we discussed last week. These build upon the things around financial literacy and understanding the financial statements of the cooperative and what kind of questions to ask. They're building upon the foundation of you need to understand your obligations as a board member, kind of the technical legal requirements based on the state where your cooperative was incorporated. And again, they're just layered on top of all those research-driven conclusions that we talked about last week. These are the markers of boards that are not just meeting those base obligations, but in my mind, functioning beyond the minimum standard criteria and over time separating themselves from the pack. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we dig in, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Please consider leaving us a review and let us know how we're doing. Subscribing and reviewing and commenting is the best way you can support the program, and it, of course, doesn't cost you a thing. Now, here we go. Let's jump into the markers of high-performing cooperative boards. The first thing I want to say, and I've got 8 different attributes here that I'm going to run through today, but at a high level, kind of the context is, I think there's also a foundational mindset that needs to be in place for the cooperative to be effective at the governance level. And I really believe that we should explicitly ask ourselves, do we see member owner or farmer director, however you want to categorize that, do we see member owner governance as an asset or a liability? And I say that because one of the things that inspired me to do the episode last week and then follow up with this week's was that I sometimes feel like even among the directors that have been voted democratically by their neighbors to represent their district within the cooperative, even among those folks, there's kind of a sense of this is a pretty tough job. Co-op boards are inherently fraught with conflict. We struggle to do well in our job. And so it's no one ever says it's a drag on the business, but no one ever says, man, this is really a competitive advantage that other folks don't have. When they talk about the co-op, they might talk about the competitive advantages that you actually have equity in the business, that it might pay, patronage dividends. You have unit retains. It's more of the financial benefits that come with it and some of the voting rights associated with it. But I actually, I think we need to believe that member owner governance is actually an asset. For all the reasons we talked about last week, I'm not going to recap today. And so before you even, whether you're a co-op GM, a management team leader, management team member, chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer of a board, a member at large of a board advisor, whatever your role is, before you start to review a given team that you work with or sit on against the criteria we're going to talk about today, I think we all need to ask ourselves, do we actually think fundamentally this is an asset or a liability? And if we don't kind of vociferously believe that this is actually an asset, if we don't give full-throated support to saying, hey, this is one of the best structures, being represented at the top level by our membership, if you don't believe that that's an asset, then that deserves some time and attention. Why do we not have that conviction? Because everything you do afterwards to be more administratively strong, procedurally intact, behaviorally aligned, if the underlying belief is not there, you're going to struggle. And so first and foremost, just spend some time thinking about that and discussing that with others in the group to say, okay, do we actually fundamentally believe this is an asset or liability? But that aside, let's go ahead and get in. The first of 8 markers of a high-performing board is a board that recognizes that management authority has been assigned, not delegated. And this is part and parcel to the idea of operating at the right level. Now, we talked last week about, having the explicit boundaries between what is governance, what is management discretion, how do you navigate, that when you kind of run up against the edges of that. And it's very real, right? This tension's always going to be there. And this tension exists even in non-cooperative businesses. But I find it very helpful to think about it in this context, in that the management authority has been assigned, not delegated, meaning it wasn't authority that resided within the board and they have decided to allow management to do it. That's what delegation is, right? You delegate tasks that used to be things that you owned, but you've now hired somebody else or tasked somebody else with doing them. Meaning, if they're not doing them well, you can claw them back. Now, maybe I have a simplified understanding of the board charters and some of the cooperative bylaws, but I guess I'm personally not familiar with any situation where if the GM were to win the lottery, get sick, quit suddenly, have to move, get fired, whatever the driver of the transition is, if the GM was no longer there, I don't think the default is for the chair of the board to step in and run the business day to day. It probably goes to an interim CEO retained from the outside or a member of that management team, right? If you think about, a Division I football team at take your college program of choice, if the athletic director fires the coach near the end of the season, or at the end of the season, they don't step in and coach the remaining games, right? If a coach gets fired before the bowl game, it's not the athletic director on the sideline wearing the headset calling plays. It's probably another member of that coach's staff. And so we need to think about this, because if it's not your job, even in the absence of that person, if it's not your job to do their job, why in the world are you trying to do their job when they're sitting in the chair? If you're not comfortable or confident in their decision making, in their actions, in their behaviors, or in their results, now that's a performance issue that needs to be addressed through one of the things the board does, which is hire or fire the GM. But they're not a proxy for you, you're not a proxy for them. And so that's a very uncomfortable situation to be in. But I think that's the first and very important thing. And it's really helped crystallize it for me is that the management authority, again, has been assigned, not delegated. And if we keep that in mind, it does help set boundaries for more effective partnership. The second marker is kind of akin to a common gripe that I know I've heard many times, and that's that directors are not by default, but can be too focused on the impacts of decisions to either their own operation or to the operations solely within their district or within the several miles around their home, right? And this is going to always be a tension. You're elected by folks in your district to represent your district within the co-op, right? That is absolutely the case. But we also know, because we get a daily example of this at the federal level in both the Senate and House of Representatives, if nobody's looking for the better outcomes for the aggregate, for the country, for the state, for the co-op overall, if we're all looking from a game theory perspective to optimize our own individual outcomes, the net outcomes are greatly diluted, if not entirely torpedoed. There does need to be recognition that you're there to represent a subset of the population, but that shared broad prosperity is shared down at the local level. And that's where the compromise comes in. What I think is actually a very effective way of doing this is as a board director sitting and saying, look, yes, I need to listen to my membership. Yes, I need to listen to my neighbors, the folks that selected me. Yes, I need to think about the impact of my own operation. But my actual prevailing objective is I need to be seeking maximum net benefit for the cooperative. Seek maximum net benefit. What I don't want to do is fall into the trap of trying to have normalized benefit distribution, meaning that if we're going to spend capital in the feed business, well, then we have to spend either an equal or a proportionally relevant amount within the energy business or the agronomy business or the grain business, or take whatever, whether it's adding staff, investing capital, deploying enabling technology, whatever it is. When we say, well, we spent money here, we spent time here, we allocated headcount here, therefore we need to do it elsewhere too. You only do that elsewhere if it's relevant to the strategy. If there are businesses that are basically, you're looking to compete and defend a shrinking market, you've got market share now, you don't want to lose it, but overall the market is contracting, that might not be the place you want to invest a bunch of capital, which might mean that on a relative basis, you're spending a hell of a lot more capital in a different division. And yes, if you're the department that's competing for a shrinking marketplace, it's going to feel pretty uncomfortable. All the capital is going to the agronomy division. Well, if within your trade area, the strategy and the analysis and the studies suggest that agronomy is going to be the engine of growth, well, that's where the money's going to need to flow. That's where the talent will need to flow. That's where the focus needs to be allocated. And so I think at a board level, if you just think about that, saying, I, of course, need to represent my membership, but also one of the ways I represent my membership is ensuring that we have a thriving, prosperous, profitable, sustainable cooperative into the future that will benefit everybody by the fact that it'll continue to exist. And so I would say seek maximum net benefit. Don't try to normalize benefit distribution across the entire cooperative, whether it's regions, divisions, whatever that breakdown might be. Now, for the balance here, we also started to get into kind of how decisions are made. And that's really, if you think about the role of a cooperative board director, you really are there to observe, listen, digest, inquire, challenge, and then ultimately make decisions. Sometimes it's a thumbs up, thumbs down, sometimes a bit more nuanced, but only making decisions. Now, to do that, that'll take us through the balance of the final 6 of the 8 I want to talk about here today. The first thing that you need to accept when you're making these decisions is that strategy is intransitive. Intransitive basically means that you don't have, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, that does not mean that A is greater than C. It also means that things are not linear. They are not fixed. They are evolving and moving over time. things are in a constant state of flux. Now, something I've observed, I'm going to be very simplistic here, so bear with me. I have observed that the instinct for some farmer directors is to apply what they're comfortable with on their farming operation into the boardroom. And on a farming operation, you have a lot of things that are changing all the time: economic conditions, commodity values, input costs, input availability, energy, labor, different pests that emerge. It's a changing environment, 100%. But what doesn't change is that the work is largely sequential. There's sequential activities that happen on a seasonal basis, which you tackle through operational thinking, right? There's a certain time we prep the ground, certain time that we plant, we might replant, we do our applications, we reapply. There's a certain cadence of how things will work, and one thing has to happen before the next thing can happen. That is not how strategy works. Strategy is not a project with a finish line. We all wish it was. We all wish that you could say, okay, the strategy is done. We've decided this is the right one. Now let's move on and execute. It's a 5-year plan. We'll come back in 5 years and we'll talk about what we do next. Great cooperative boards understand that strategy is never settled. It shifts with the market. It shifts with membership composition. It shifts with the moves of your competitors. All the things are changing it. And so the board's job isn't to ratify a plan once and then just periodically monitor execution. I think the board's job is to stay in active dialogue with management about the strategy, knowing that it's always changing, knowing that to some degree it's always in motion. And it doesn't mean you're going to relitigate the strategy every time some tactic has to shift, but you have to say, okay, look, does the thing that we approved 2 years ago, a 5-year directional vision of the future, still make sense? Now, certainly the tactics are going to adjust. We kind of get used to that, but we also need to accept that maybe that destination point is no longer relevant. It's no longer possible. Maybe what we decided is actually no longer that ambitious. What we thought was a stretch goal is actually kind of a layup, and we ought to be pushing harder. So really, this needs to be inherent. The strategy is changing. It's intransitive. It's not sequential. It's not linear. And we need to make sure that this is reflected in how our board meetings are structured, what gets agenda time, and how you're engaging between meetings even, to stay rooted in what's the strategy we approved and what is its relevance to the conditions on the ground today. I'm not asking or inviting you to start to question every single little tactic that's taken day to day within the business, but to rather be looking at the entirety of where's it we're trying to go and what's it we're trying to do to get there. Number 4, and I want to go through this one quickly because I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but strong performing boards don't fall victim to what I call decision friction. And we will link in the show notes way back in episode 65 of the program. And this was in June of 24. We did a show about decision friction. And the idea about decision friction is that you can have groups of people who are in a room together, in a meeting together, in a series of meetings together. They're being presented with information. They're digesting data. They're engaging in debates. And it all seems good and fine. But what's going on underneath the surface level is that they all are trying to decide things in a different context or with a different scope of the decision. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's really 3 main categories that I apply to this: exploratory, evaluatory, and confirmatory. Very simply put, exploratory is our discussion here today is to learn about a topic, learn about an opportunity, learn about a market, learn about an acquisition segment or set of companies, but it is purely exploratory. We're not seeking commitment. We're not seeking action. We simply want to learn more and know more when we leave the room than we walked in the door. Evaluatory is where you're actually saying, okay, we've gathered a lot of information about this. Now, what does that tell us about strategic alignment? Is this aligned to the things we said we wanted to do? Is this additive to the future that we want to create? Does this help us make incremental or dramatic improvements in that direction? Does this fit within our investment thesis, our financial capabilities, our risk tolerance? Basically, evaluatory is, we're evaluating, is this a fit for us? Right? So you move beyond exploration into evaluation. Now, confirmatory is sort of that final one of, we've explored it, we understand it, we've evaluated it, we've assessed it. Now, confirmatory is, what do we need to know, or how do we need to get agreement that yes or no, we're going to pursue this? Now, so you can see if you have folks in different mindsets there, it can get pretty messy pretty fast. When a board is misaligned on which mode they're in, the meeting seems like it's going great until suddenly it goes nowhere. Or worse yet, you think you made a decision, but everyone made different decisions. So a very simple example here, imagine that you're handling an issue like we want to upgrade our applicator fleet on a rolling 3-year basis is something that we're looking at. Here's the different types of equipment options. Here's the financing options. Here's the costs. Here's the capabilities. Here's what the implications would be for serving our trade area. It's basically a reinvestment opportunity within your agronomy business, your precision ag product service offering. Now, if you have a director who shows up in confirmatory mode, I'm going to try to say yes or no to this. Management wants you to be in the exploratory mode. You're just here to learn and understand. We're not going to ask you for a decision now. This is a capital request that's coming in 6 months. And the balance of the board is like, well, we're evaluating. Does this fit our strategy? Well, you can imagine the folks that are preparing and presenting information, speaking to a group of people that want to get to the next level of, is this a strategic fit versus what are the facts we need to know? And then you got one or two people that are saying, at the end of this, we're going to say yes or no. You can imagine what a suboptimal use of time that is. And I bet that the majority of you listening can probably also think of examples in the not too distant past where maybe you hadn't thought about it in the terms of, we're all making different decisions. But if you sit back and look at that, it probably showed up in different ways. Now, the fix here isn't complicated. That's the great news. The fix is simple. You just got to name at the start of every discussion what it is we're trying to decide. Name the decision scope. You can use our words if you want. Is this exploratory, evaluatory, confirmatory? Give it whatever names you want. But I think it's really important that management and the board either states or asks, before we get into the details, I think it's important that we all align on where are we trying to get today. Doing that, if all of a sudden half the board thought they needed to make a thumbs up, thumbs down confirmatory decision, but the management team says, hey guys, look, we gave you a bunch of information last month. This month, we really want to evaluate options one against the other to kind of get a sense of which one is more strategically aligned. That actually takes the pressure off. And now those folks that were feeling the pressure of, I have to decide yes or no at the end of this meeting, can take a deep breath and say, oh no, actually my job is to sort of let's assess these. So again, episode 65, we will link to it in the show notes. Decision friction. And high-performing boards are very good about getting clear on what are they actually trying to decide or not decide in a given meeting.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
All right, so let's go to the back half of these here. Thanks for sticking with us. The fifth one is kind of a learning posture marker, and that's high-performing boards demonstrate consistently that they seek to understand first and they assess and challenge second. So kind of building upon the decision friction, this is really a sequencing problem. I would say that the vast majority of directors that I've interacted with are not bad actors. Certainly don't have bad intentions. They just sometimes might jump to step 2 before completing step 1. And that means that they've shifted from understanding right into assessing. So akin to decision friction we just talked about. Here's why I want to call this out specifically. For folks that can't help themselves, that just can't help jumping from understanding to assess, the moment you shift into that assessment mode, you are inherently often challenging the information being brought forward. And the moment you're challenging information, there is a subliminal sort of phenomena that I've observed. I can't test this. I don't have brain scans and information to prove it. But when you start to go into challenging mode, you tend to stop receiving new information. And if you're no longer receiving new information, how do you know you're making the best decisions? In a boardroom, that's compounded because when one or two directors start doing that, when they start to challenge an idea versus understanding the entirety of the idea and why we're even talking about it, I mean, in your head, you can still be like, this is a terrible, stupid idea, but you ought to make sure that we understand why we're spending time on it. The moment that a couple of folks do this, the other directors are going to read the room. And one of two things happen. Either they all pile on and they jump on the challenge, attack wagon, or they go quiet, or there's a split down the middle. What's happening at the end of the day is if you're no longer looking to understand, how can you have any sense of are we actually deriving our decisions and our conclusions from, is this aligned to our strategy? Does this have the impact that we want? Or are we focused on something else? We focus on the fact that we don't like this person, so we don't like their proposal. Or we don't like this because we think it's going to have a negative impact to our local elevator. Or we don't like this because, pick your reason, right? So the boards that have norms around that genuine curiosity, learning and listening before getting into the critique. Now, the critique's very important, so I'm not taking that away from anybody. But the folks that have that genuine curiosity and index heavily there first, you actually get more and better information out of management. You can actually surface more dissent within the board itself. And generally, that means you end up making better decisions. So this is something you really want to think about. Am I seeking to understand first before I assess and challenge second? And I'll give you an example of this. And it's around asset closures. And I've seen this play out many, many times where there are, folks will bring forward the idea we need to close some assets. And these assets are no longer economical. We're not getting volume to cover fixed costs. They're too expensive to maintain from a compliance perspective. They're not strategic, they're too slow. There's a variety of reasons. But the questions end up becoming, the question of challenges, you just can't let this happen. We can't close it. We can't be a co-op that closes elevators. Or you need to offer free storage to incent bushels to come in. Or this is going to screw the customers in that area. Or we're going to lose all the grain business because they're going to go down the road to the other elevator and they're probably going to take their agronomy business with them. Those questions that are sort of challenging forfeit the opportunity to learn. So maybe a better set of questions might be things like, okay, I understand you guys are proposing we're going to close 5 or 6 or 10 elevators. What would need to be true for us to not make this decision? What would need to be true for us to not propose closing these? And challenge management to sort of articulate, here's what success would look like where they would no longer feel the need to be proposing this. Then you sort of say, okay, well, how far are we from the truth? If it's volume, if it's reinvestment, if it's fixed costs, whatever the drivers are, okay, how far are we from the truth? So what's the daylight between where we're at and where we'd like to be? Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Is that something we can control? What have we done already to try to close that daylight? Let's get rooted on the decisions that we've already made, the things we've already tried. Guys, I understand that this is going to be pretty uncomfortable. Well, how do you guys think about managing transitions of the customers? Rather than, well, they're going to take all their grain with them and probably the agronomy, kind of a bombastic, hyperbolic statement that's only going to put people on their heels. Assume that management has a plan and ask, how are you going to manage customer transitions? If they don't have a plan, that's a whole separate discussion. Chances are they can probably articulate to you how they've thought about transitioning customers. Then you can ask, well, what do you expect our volume losses to be? Right? How much of if we close these elevators, how much of that volume actually will end up going through a different location versus going to the competition? Do you think there's going to be spillover? Are we going to lose energy business? Are we going to lose agronomy business? What's the impact to our feed division? Asking questions gets you information, and it actually helps you make a better decision. Now, number 6, I know I'm going long here, so I'll try to speed this up, is very closely tied to number 5, but it's an interesting concept I always want to pull out separately, and that is the concept of strong opinions loosely held. Now, this is based on the idea of assertive inquiry, which is from a book, Playing to Win, by the former chairman and CEO of Procter & Gamble, and also an academic in management strategy. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's a great book. One of the tiny things I talked about in that book, not quite a footnote, but also not a main thesis, but I think is really profound, is the idea of assertive inquiry. And that's really a communication technique that balances the clear and confident expression of your own ideas with a sincere desire to understand the perspectives of others. So that's why it's the same as seeking to understand that we just talked about, but it's also a bit different. It's the idea that you can walk into a room, Mr. or Mrs. Director, sit down at a table, have somebody start to prepare and propose something that you're pretty well steeped in. And in your head, you say, I have something important to say about this, but I want to make sure I'm not missing something, right? So it's not, you don't have to either say, I know everything I need to know, or I'm a complete Luddite here and I have no idea what's going on. I'm a rube off the street and they need to explain to me like I'm 5. No, you can have something important to say, but you also want to make sure you're not missing something. So the co-op version of this marker is particularly important because farmer directors often carry strong operational convictions that are shaped by decades of running their own operations. That's a feature, not a bug. The problem is if it becomes a closed loop where I apply what I believe I know about the business based on my own business, and I'm not all that interested in evaluating if I've missed something. I'm going to take my preconceived notions and I'm going to drive forward. So the boards that perform best, they aren't the ones that simply defer to, they're not the most deferential directors that just sort of sign off on management's proposals. They're the ones where every director brings a credible point of view into the room and they hold that point of view. They can explain it and defend it, but they have enough intellectual humility to update their point of view when new information warrants it, right? So that's really the important thing is I have a strong and important point of view on this topic, but I'm going to sit on my hands and ask questions because I want to make sure that I have not missed something yet. You still get to vote at the end, either way. Now, number 7, highly effective boards assign a very low cost to candor in the boardroom, but a very high cost to silence. This is not a concept that needs a lot of scaffolding to articulate what we're going after here, but I'll explain for just a moment. I think we all intuitively know that having candor in the boardroom is a good thing. And I would suspect that most of us would admit that we probably don't always have enough of it, right? Sometimes things are said in indirect ways. Objections are somewhat cloudy in kind of how they're framed up. Maybe somebody's very bombastic and they are being very candid, but maybe not in a incredibly productive way. But I think the core point is that we need to have candor in the boardroom, and we need to have a low cost to candor if it's delivered respectfully, right? Being a dissenter shouldn't mean that you pay a political cost for it. So what drives the cost of candor up? Well, sometimes it's just the perceived cost of candor because folks don't want to engage in conflict, and I'm guilty of that too. But there are other things that can actually drive up real cost of candor. You might have a board culture that sort of says, hey, look, you don't openly challenge folks that have more tenure than you. Or we, on sticky matters where there's kind of no perfect choice, we defer to the chair. Maybe it's a culture of the last thing I'm going to do look in here is look uninformed, right? So, or maybe there's a cost of candor, there's a social cost. I don't want to dissent on a topic that benefits my neighbor who I'm going to see at the elevator next week, right? Even if it's the best thing for the co-op, if I vote yes on this thing, for example, or if I express support for it, but I know everyone else is against it, I'm going to pay a price outside the boardroom. You need to have a low cost of candor and recognize everyone's there for the right reasons. Everyone was elected by their neighbors and the fellow membership to represent them. If they're doing a good job of seeking that maximum net benefit that we talked about earlier, the cost of candor should be low. It should be a safe place to have dissent and intellectual debate and disagreement within that boardroom. On the flip side, you need to assign a high cost to silence because silence is not a risk-free alternative, right? If there's a high cost of candor, it doesn't mean there's a low cost of silence. It's just a delayed cost with some finance charges along the way. Because what happens with the high cost of silence is, one, you miss things that you would learn through discussion by not bringing up questions along the way, by just staying quiet. You miss insights, the ability to maybe understand what people are trying to say because you didn't challenge. But underlying all of it is when folks are silent in the boardroom ahead of a decision, there's this slow accumulation, this buildup, this compounding of unspoken concerns that might surface later in some of the most unfortunate ways, right? A discussion where everyone felt we're going in one direction, it comes to a vote, and it suddenly becomes a very contentious vote because there's a big cohort of people who did not engage in the discussions, but voted in a way that, we had forfeit the opportunity to discuss this, and now it's actually codified as a vote. Or it could even be during a crisis, right? Something happens in the business, and all of a sudden, everybody who was silent said, see, I knew this was going to happen. I knew this was a problem. I never thought we should do that. And it's like, well, it turns out if in fact your instincts were your instincts 6, 12, 18 months ago, if you actually knew this was a problem, if you knew we shouldn't do it, if you knew this was going to happen, well, we're now paying a cost for your silence. You ought to have said something back then. And so that's why I think a low cost of candor, high cost of silence is absolutely critical. Number 8, final one. Thanks for sticking with us today. This, again, dovetails right on the one before it, and it's really where we need to land the plane and close the loop. It's going to sound so obvious, so just bear with me for a moment here. But highly effective boards, they engage in that debate, and once the vote happens, they commit to the outcome of that vote, and they advocate for that vote and that decision despite their own dissent. Let's say that again. You engage in the debate, and that vote happens, and even if it's not the way you wanted things to go, you commit to it. You commit to your fellow board. I'm going to commit to this. I understand we made this decision together. It's not the one I wanted, but we did it. And now I'm going to advocate for it despite the fact that I was a dissenting view. Losing a vote in a corporate or cooperative boardroom and then going out there and privately undermining the decision is absolutely catastrophic. And here's why I bring it up today, because it's easy to characterize that as a character failure. That individual lacks integrity because they went out there and they were undermining our decision and sort of poisoning the well, if you will, out in the community. And that might be true. But when it happens, when this kind of thing happens time and again, when there's backsliding, a decision was made, but then folks go out and start to communicate otherwise, or why they didn't agree with it in the community. When it happens time and again with one individual, or when it happens time and again across multiple individuals, the accountability for fixing it's no longer an individual person who has maybe some character defects or integrity, if you want to say that. It becomes a governance failure. And it has to be corrected. It has to say, look, we made this vote. We know the vote was not 12 yay and 0 nay. We know it was a 9-3. Let's not just close the vote and move on. Let's say, okay, the vote has been recorded. Decisions has been made. Can we take a couple minutes to talk about advocacy? Can we take a couple minutes to talk about how we're going to carry this forward? What do those dissenting voters need from the balance of the group to support them? It's not a matter of if you're on the losing side, you get piled on by the winning side. The winning side ought to support you and say, hey, look, this is going to be uncomfortable. We recognize now you have the unpleasant but necessary obligation to go out and champion something that you don't agree with. None of us like that. But you have to recognize it. If there's fallout and dissent in a corporate in a cooperative boardroom, it's healthy, one, but that fallout is contained, right? It's a group of professionals that can kind of get through it together if they're willing to talk about it. And of course, you should never expect all your decisions to be unanimous. If you have every one of your board decisions is unanimous, there's a whole separate series of episodes you should probably do, right? About what's going on there. Especially if the board's weighing into complex, future-oriented, sort of risky issues facing the co-ops and membership, service level changes, new investments in rolling stock, asset changes, mergers, turning over management. All these things have a suite of imperfect choices, and there's non-obvious best courses of action. So because of that, there ought to be rigorous debate. But again, that all happens contained within the boardroom. When a dissenting director goes back to the elevator, or goes to the coffee shop, or is in a Bible study, kind of having coffee after study, or is in an annual meeting, and they persist with their dissent out in the community, outside the four walls of that boardroom, the outfall is not contained the fallout's not contained anymore. That blast radius is larger and it's irreversible because it starts to undermine the entirety of the board, not just that decision, but how decisions are made in general, their credibility, their effectiveness, their ability to do their job. And so this is something that whether you're the person who has struggled and had some missteps in the past and needs to look in the mirror and say, okay, what can I do differently or better? Or you're on a board where somebody else has done that, you all have a shared responsibility to address it and try to get better and support one another with some grace, with some care, but with some firm love as well. So again, I just want to be clear, dissent before the decision is healthy. It should be expected. Dissent after the decision, and especially in front of membership, is a very deep and trust and governance problem. And I think great boards commit to this explicitly, not just implicitly, and they practice it religiously. So in closing, again, these are not abstract ideas. They're observable behaviors. Run through them quickly. Management authority is assigned, not delegated. Seek maximum benefit, not normalized distribution. Accept that strategy is always changing. Don't fall victim to decision friction. Know what you're trying to decide. Understand first and challenge second. Have strong opinions loosely held. Assign a low cost to candor, a high cost to silence. And above all, commit to decisions and advocate even in the face of dissent. So whether you're a co-op GM, a board officer, or a regular board member, as you read this lineup and you assess it against your current board, you know which ones you have and which ones you don't. And the work of building a great board isn't just recruiting the right people, right, to fill those seats. It isn't just getting the most competent folks voted in. It's about building the norms and the culture that are going to bring out these kinds of behaviors consistently. And that's a job that belongs to the chair, that belongs to the GM, and belongs to every director in that room. So I would argue in closing that these aren't just best practices to consider, but they're rather standards of behavior that are necessary to deliver the best value you can to the co-op in the way that you make decisions, the way that you engage in that process of decision making, and the way that you carry it forward and own the outcomes. This is the best thing you can do for the co-op, for your member owners, and for your communities. Thank you for listening in today. Longer than I expected. I appreciate those of you still listening, going the distance. Thank you for being a part of the Pacesetter Pod community, taking the time to listen in and think about ways to turn strategy into outcomes in your agribusiness. We always appreciate you participating. We'd love to hear what you think about today's episode. And I look forward to having you join us next week right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.